I personally am really looking forward to our next session. Our next session is by Tamarah Moss. I just met Tamarah this morning, and I already feel like
We're besties.
We're besties. Already.
Already.
Before she's even spoken. So Tamarah is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research at Bryn Mawr College. She's going to talk to us on the topic of painting a path for museums and other visual art spaces on becoming more culturally responsive and trauma-informed. Tamarah, over to you.
Everyone, and welcome. I am a talker, so I need to keep my notes with me because we need to finish on good time. My name again is Tamarah Moss. She, her, hers are my pronouns. And again, I'm on faculty with the Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research. It is with great honor and pleasure to be here with you in such a meaningful experience and conference. A huge thanks to the hosts here at the University of Pennsylvania, and also the folks, Sarah and James, for the invitation, and colleagues who have worked to plan, including Catherine and others. A real honor. So what I'd like us to do, just so you know where we're headed, is to share the agenda. So we were welcomed. There's some discussion guidelines that I want us to use to just frame our interaction. You should have sheets of colored paper. So my session's going to be really interactive. We're going to then have a pause in our day for collective self-care. James shared how there's a lot going on in our world, in our state, in our cities and counties. And so we just want to pause as we work on becoming more culturally responsive and trauma-informed, practice that within our setting. We're then going to think about the participants in our communities, who's visiting, who's coming to our museums and visual art spaces. Gain an understanding of what I'm talking about when I say culturally responsive. What am I referring to when I use the terms trauma-informed and the approach and the key principles and assumptions? And then some key ingredients for me, you, us to think about at the organizational level. How do we become more trauma-informed and culturally responsive? From the description of our time together, there's reference to the Missouri model, which was developed by the Department of Health and Human Services in the state of Missouri, that I think has really broader application for our work, whether service-oriented in the way that I know through social work and public health predominantly, or the work that you all are doing as artists, museums, and other visual art spaces. And then we're going to leave with an action step. I am an educator, so there's some instructions coming with your sheet of paper. So from a non-artist who appreciate art, you're going to be taking that sheet of paper with you and dividing it into 4 sections, however you want. 4 sections. The first section is going to be what I'm calling around the theme of painting in your mind. Because we're painting the path, remember? That's our topic, around how to become more culturally responsive and trauma-informed. The second part will be us preparing the canvas. Again, I'm not an artist, but I appreciate art. I was telling James and others, I was looking forward to your presence today and the fashion that would appear, because we have an arts community and you all delivered. The third part that you're going to section off, and I'll remind you as we go through, choosing the colors for our painting. So where we're starting, we're painting in our mind, we're preparing our canvas, and we're choosing the colors for our painting. And then the fourth part, our fourth section, is where we're going to be starting to paint our path or our pathway. That action step. So what's going to be the takeaway from our time together? All right, so I'll be reminding you where we are. It will come up in our slides, which section, and that's where I want you to take some interesting notes around the activities and questions that I'm going to ask today. How I got here is interesting. In terms of my social work and public health background, I studied biopsychology in undergraduate. So I was a person who's interested in behavior. combining neuroscience with bio and cultural anthropology, among other things, including linguistics, and thinking about culture, even at the undergraduate level. Once I got done with my dual masters, I then received an internship at the Smithsonian in Washington, DC. That work was focused on understanding how participants in museums interact with exhibits from a behavioral level. I did not take on the internship and went on to become a research associate doing other focus groups kinds of things around being culturally transformative in the materials that we are providing through different federal programs and other qualitative research approaches. But that opportunity has never left my mind, and here I am with you all today. Thinking behaviorally, how do we respond in a way in our museums and visual arts spaces to be, and I will say this ad nauseum, more culturally responsive and trauma informed. For today's discussion, I want us to be present. There's so much else we can be doing today, and we're so thankful that you're here. To replace judgment with wonder. So things that may not be as clear, to remain curious and hold that posture. To take space and make space. So as we're sharing, if you've shared already, maybe make some space for someone else who may not have shared to have the opportunity to own intent and impact. So we're using those I statements. My experience has been controversy with civility. So we may not agree with everything that's shared, or even when we have our small group discussions, but to hold that with civility and respect. And then confidentiality, as we're sharing stories and experiences, to be protective of those who are involved. Yes, and this is from work that I have done based upon community-based organizations, coming up with these types of ideas that you may want to incorporate through your discussions with community, whether that's internally facing in terms of staff and others, or externally in terms of the communities that you serve. What I want you to keep in your mind as we're walking through our moments today is that what I'm doing is demonstrating ways that you might want to integrate cultural responsiveness and trauma informed into your work. Yes, so this is one way. Perhaps I'm developing some discussion guidelines. Our collective self-care pause. I want us to take a few moments to acknowledge and honor the trauma and pain that surrounds us, as well as the moments of healing and restoration that may occur and surround us as well. Thank you for indulging me. What are our responsibilities towards each other? How can we be in solidarity with other professionals who work to become trauma-informed and culturally responsive? And then finally, how do the dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression affect us, the communities we serve, and the organizations that we represent? Okay, so let's start painting. Okay. What I'd like you to do in groups of 3 or 4, find a neighbor, is to answer these questions and take some quick notes on that first section of your paper. What comes to mind when you think about museums and spaces of visual arts? What comes to your mind? What words, what images? Jot those down. What comes to mind when you think of culture? We've had some framing from our earlier presentations on what culture might be. But what comes to mind when you think of culture? And what is the connection of museums, visual art spaces? Okay, so you'll have 2 minutes. Get in your groups of 3 or 4 to answer these questions. Find a neighbor. We only got 2 minutes. Get to know each other. It's kind of like very big. And you're right now, which I love like a lot. Now they're doing like beautiful flash workshop. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Your discussion around connecting museums. Notice I say visual art spaces. We talked about those basements, those backyards, those pop-ups, if you will. So not necessarily standalone spaces and culture. What's the connection that came up in your discussion? Just shout them at me. Y'all didn't get that far. Right. Okay, so you didn't have a discussion, but what are you thinking? Yes, please, Cal.
We talked about a connection to time or history.
Time and history, that's come up, yeah, in our previous discussions around framing the work, thinking about flourishing. And those different maps that we saw, history, what's historically going on, has happened, and where are we now? Excellent. Any other thoughts? History and time. It's another connection.
Technology.
What was that?
Technology. I spent
Technology.
a lot of time in science museums and how those exhibits explain a lot about how our culture has evolved.
Very much so.
Very much like how this is influencing our lives these days. Whereas back in the 60s and 70s, there was no way to communicate the way we do today.
Excellent. Technology. So time, history, technology. Some spaces were limited to only tours, one-on-one, someone talking about it. Now we can take our own self-paced tours with headphones and other things. During COVID was the mention of doing those tours digitally. Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, please.
Some of our conversation had to do with spaces of thinking about these spaces as spaces of rest, but also spaces of unrest in the land that museums are built on, there's collections curated by choice or not.
Or not. Excellent. So holding both the rest pieces of our work, but also the unrest. And then how do we address that? Yes, and be responsive to it and trauma informed. one more idea that came up with connection. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Oh, we talked about perspective, both that what you see can broaden your perspective, but also that all the participants in the space bring their own perspectives.
Yes, very much so. So perspective, that is external facing, yes, what we can see, but also the internal facing perspectives that are not necessarily seen unless they're shared among participants that may come up. Keep these thoughts in mind. We're just thinking about our painting. We haven't started it yet. So this leads me into our discussion about what is being culturally responsive as we consider the connections of museum and visual art spaces with culture. I offer up this guide in thinking about a culturally responsive approach that comes out of my work as a culturally responsive and equitable evaluator. So it's this idea of integrating diversity, inclusion, and equity principles. We're engaging with the individuals most impacted, so that rest and unrest, rated by will or not, how do we hold both and work with those who've been directly impacted? Incorporates cultural, structural, and contextual considerations. We were looking at structures within cities, within urban centers, and how they're represented. So thinking about how that's incorporated. And then advancing equity by informing the strategy. Those meetings where we're sitting and planning for those exhibits. Those educational programs, program improvement, decision-making, policy formation that we learned about, and ultimately change. So when we think of a culturally responsive approach, it's important for us, hopefully you're seeing the logic of making the connection with the museum and visual arts and culture, and then being responsive to that. And here are some ideas around that, both in the programming, but also the evaluation. And when I refer to evaluation, not only numbers, how many people came, but how meaningful was the experience. And so that becoming a part of our level of effectiveness, meaning making and meaningfulness. When we consider the roles of museums and visual art spaces, they're there to help us feel proud of where we've come from, potentially challenging and stimulating us, breaking down barriers to access and inclusion, preserving cultural heritage, and promoting the rights of the marginalized. These are just some, not an exhaustive list, as we think about what's the connection, what's the culture, culturally responsive way, and then how do we think more expansively about our roles as museums and other visual art spaces. Okay, let's get ready to prepare the canvas. So we thought about our painting. I know there may be some painters here. These are just 4 steps from a non-artist. I hope y'all are getting the point. Yes? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay, preparing the canvas. So we've thought about what we're gonna paint. We've identified what comes to mind when we hear museums, visual art spaces, culture. We've drawn a connection. We have a better understanding of what culturally responsiveness may look like. We want to prepare our canvas and start to think about our spaces. Some characteristics for consideration: accessibility. How is someone who may be a wheelchair user able to get around in your space? What about someone who may have some visual and hearing impairment able to appreciate an audio presentation? Have you ever been in spaces where you may see a piece of art and then there's this tiny little box like this big and the font's like 2 font? Yes, to describe who the artist is and what was behind the work. So all those things related to design need to be considered. Space distribution. Where are we situating the information desks, the restrooms, the resting areas, rest and unrest, the spaces where we could just think and be? Preservation of cultural heritage. As we honor others, were the others that we're honoring a part of this experience? Have they been informed of the design and it been a co-created space? Security and safety. Some of our spaces they're very dimly lit. I've been in some of those spaces, but guess what? There's only one way to enter and one way to exit. For someone, based on my culture and my experience, that may be alarming. So how do we consider to have the dimly lit space with the featured exhibit, but then it feels safe enough? So should an emergency happen, there's not only one space to leave. Logistics, timing of hours, locations, display of conceptual threads, those tiny 2-font displays to make them larger. Yes? Any other characteristics folks are thinking of as you think about design in your spaces? What's come up in your discussions? Yes, please.
For space distribution, I think there's an element not just of meeting physical needs, presumed or the communicated prominence or importance of what is in those spaces. So what do you see when you first enter? What is in the back corner and kind of marginalized? What are you bringing forth for in terms of attention?
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that. That makes me think of how I'd been in a space in a museum and they had featured artists from all over the world. The work of the artists of color that were on display were not available in the museum store. You know how you'll have the postcard, the scarf, the pen. So I was running when I could run, I'm healing, to the museum store because I was like, oh, I have to get that artist's work. They're of color and it's exquisite, the work that they're doing. There was nothing in the museum store that I could purchase to take with me, to hold on to, that resonated with me. However, the other artists, more prominently known, more Eurocentric, if you will, had the scarves, the postcards, the mugs, the bags. So how we think about even our, how should I say? Because museum stores, I'm imagining, help with finances, yes. How do we think and make that more inclusive, culturally responsive to our participants? Thank you for raising space distribution. Cal Sky, hi Cal, who's here, is a clinical social worker, photographer, and PhD student at Bryn Mawr College, thinks about things related to sensory load, structural impact on well-being, the power of place and trauma-informed design. Please reach out to them. And how we think about that inclusive design. The work of Dr. Juan Rios at Seton Hall, almost went out my mind, social worker as well, refers to this idea of radical inclusion. And so what might that look like when an organization, your museum and your visual space, considers itself a part of the community? Get ready for some more group work. Same groups, I know. We're now so we're thinking about it, now we're preparing our canvas. Under your preparing canvas, 2 minutes. How do you describe the participants who visit your spaces and what are their cultural characteristics? You got 2 minutes. This is the canvas part. I know. I know, you're working. Yeah.
They're like. I don't think they're, so I can describe them well, area. So how do we actually? And all these ladies are like. I mean, I know I'm so short of. Yeah, I felt that sponsor. I just feel like, well, yeah.
Let's hear about who's coming to your space. How would you describe them? Who's coming into your space?
Curious,
Say again.
curious and supportive.
Curious and supportive people. Huh. Excellent. Curious and supportive. Who else is coming into your visual spaces? Yes.
People searching for shared experiences, like an opportunity to share with others.
Yes. So wanting shared experiences, opportunities to share, curious and supportive. Who else is visiting? Thank you for that. Excellent. Yes.
Across a lifespan, from babies to elders, and
Yes.
all different types of abilities. So folks with intellectual disabilities, elders and wheelchair walkers, folks who have visual hearing, neurodiversity, everybody.
Wonderful. Diverse across the lifespan, across abilities, across mobilities. Yes, that's who's coming into our visual art spaces. Excellent. Thank you. Any others? Yes, please.
I want some outdoor spaces with folk art and I want them to be dog friendly. And of course, I want, companion animals allowed in indoor spaces like seeing eye dogs and such. And my colleague wants open-minded people
So
and friendly
open-minded,
people.
friendly, right, to come into our spaces. They're animal friendly as well. What are the cultural characteristics of participants in your programs and who are visiting in your museums? What's their cultural characteristic? Yes, please.
Ours was really that it would feel so open and economically available to anyone. And that it would become a space that was there, even if you just wanted to hook up with your friend and meet with them, like there was no barriers to it.
Yes.
So even if you weren't there to see, necessarily to see the art,
Yes.
you were there because that was an open community space that you wanted to be in.
Excellent. Thank you for opening and expanding our minds around culture and including economics as part of that. Because sometimes we may only think about race and ethnicity things, but economically open could just come and be free in a free space. Yes, excellent. Other cultural characteristics. Yes, please.
We just talked about how sometimes depending on the space, those who are visiting might not have the same cultural characteristics of the place
Yeah.
that the space is. So you might have a lot of visitors who don't necessarily match your cultural characteristic or values or
I just want to name that that sometimes is a piece of what we're interacting with.
Very much so. So you make me think, Cal, that we also have to think about, well, what's the culture of our museum and visual art spaces? How are we naming that? And then might it be what? Perceived. Excellent. And sometimes the physical spaces where museums and visual art spaces are do not match the community where they're geolocated. So there's some disparate kind of situation, there's some disconnect. As we think about urban centers, we saw the maps. Where are those museums and visual art spaces? And what's their connection to the community surrounding them? And do the cultures have an understanding, not necessarily coming together as one, but how is that museum, that art space being perceived by that very community where it's geolocated? We have this framework in social work that's called person and environment. It's a practice guidance principle that helps us and other professions understand individuals and communities from the perspective of the environment. So the environment is not just people and relationships, remember our framing earlier, but also the physical, social, and cultural environments that we live, work, and play in. This framework is sometimes referred to as socio-ecological framework. Yes. One of the big pioneers around it is Bronfenbrenner. Just as a reference, I'm going to be sending a list of links to Sarah and others. So when you get your follow-up mail, you have some resources to work with, take back with you, have conversations around. You then have to think about the trauma part, how we trauma inform. Because we got some understanding of what culturally responsive is, right? We started the painting. We're now preparing the canvas and thinking about, well, what's this reference to trauma informed? We're not a clinical space, nor do I want to suggest that you become one. However, as we think about the roles of museums as being a place where people feel healthier, have pride, take pride around their health and well-being, we're sharing culture, we don't want to be part of the re-traumatization in people's lives. So trauma is an experience resulting from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening with lasting adverse effects on individuals' functioning, mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and/or spiritually, which are some of the words we might use to describe the way that we want people to engage with our art. Physically, emotionally, mentally, socially, spiritually. So the same participants who are coming to our spaces, and let's not forget those of us who work in the spaces, bring our own backgrounds that may have trauma experiences, whether directly or indirectly. There's some key assumptions that we want to think about in our approaches. Whereas a practitioner, program, organization, or system that's trauma-informed, we are realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understanding the potential paths of recovery. So when I'm referring to trauma, we don't want to stay in that place of deficiency, but also think of recovery. And so as we describe the impact of art, the visual arts, museum spaces, the recovery that may be able to happen as well. There's responsiveness by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. That part where we talked about considerations for the actual space, right? Around safety, logistics, accessibility. That's ways that we can actively seek to not re-traumatize our participants or ourselves as workers in these spaces. Examples of trauma, we can go on. Think about what those might be. But what I want us to focus on more are the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. These include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues. All things that came up when we described our participants, thought about the connections in culture, and now 6 principles to incorporate in a trauma-informed approach. Okay, so we started the painting, we're preparing the canvas, now we're gonna pick our color. Yeah. Of those 6 principles, and I'll get back to them, we're gonna work as a larger group in just 1 minute. Which of the principles might be the most achievable? I'll bring them back up on our screen. Which might be the most challenging, and what are the reasons for your choice? So as we're picking our colors and thinking about what principle is more feasible, achievable, which one resonates with you in the work that you're currently doing and or aspire to do? Do you want to strengthen your work around empowerment, voice, and choice? What about trustworthiness and transparency in holding both the rest and unrest, for example? What principle resonates with you? Don't all rush and raise your hands. I can't tell who's raising their hand or not. Yes, thank you.
Trustworthiness and transparency, I think, is, I've had a little bit of a crisis in that regard, where think because of where many cultural objects came from, and rather than engaging in those conversations as they should, they've sort of run from them in many examples, and that has created a trust with the organizations that is really challenging in terms of both keeping audiences, but certainly in growth.
Sure. And that area of trustworthiness and transparency. Thank you for that. One more, yes, please.
The issue of cultural, historical, and gender issues, the same point.
Please.
Because there has been a Eurocentric, heterosexist, male focus in so much of the culture and history that's not been inclusive. And the whole question of history, who tells the story, how it's told, whose story is it, and is it really honest and real, is a much deeper issue. So I think it's really hard to be authentic on that point.
Really helpful. So as we're picking our colors, yes, in our painting, think about which principle, if it were a color or range of colors, are you working well at? Yeah, it may be the collaboration and neutrality, because that is in your mission. It is always co-creation going on with your community. Or is it that you want to work on the cultural, historical, and gender issues of your museum or your visual art space? Some key ingredients for us to think about at the organizational level are leading and communicating about the transformation process. And transformation process is dynamic. So it's not a one-off, like, oh, we're gonna work on empowerment and then that's it. No, it's continuous, it's a continuum, it's changing. Just as the participants that we're able to hold on to, we have new folks coming through in our spaces as well. Creating a safe environment and preventing that secondary traumatic stress in staff and participants alike. So as we're focusing externally on our participants that come to our museums and visual art spaces, we also need to think about our staff as well. How feasible are these ingredients for applications in our settings? And who are the beneficiaries? And so prioritizing participants as well as staff is a good place to start. We have 1 minute to start to paint our path. Our painting's almost done, y'all. So what is one action step you're gonna take towards becoming culturally responsive and trauma informed? Write that down. There's some power in writing stuff down. So we started our painting, we're preparing the canvas. Take 1 minute to let me know what your action step is that you're gonna take away from our session today. I see people thinking and writing. I got like no seconds left. Who wants to share? Yes, please.
I have a question or an observation, probably both.
Yes.
But I would love to get yours, maybe others' thoughts on this, maybe just a good food for thought. Obviously, trauma is a really serious issue. I'm a professional artist, I'm a musician myself, as mentioned. And what I didn't know getting into music is that music is something that can help us to process trauma and work at the subconscious level, visual arts as well. Recently, I saw an exhibition by the Austrian painter Gottfried Ellenwein, who's a very famous painter. Talk about re-traumatizing. The whole theme of his artwork is the childhood innocence and the violence that is sometimes perpetrated against children by adults. And some of his works are just outright shocking. They're hyper realistic. They're absolutely extraordinary. He's an example of genuine masquerade. And in this connection, it's not about, I don't think it's about avoiding trauma triggers necessarily. Maybe it's but at the same time, this is something that can help us to confront, maybe even process trauma. So I found his exhibition, on the one hand, talk about triggering and potentially re-traumatizing. On the other hand, transformative doesn't avoid trauma, like you are confronted. So that's just food for thought. Maybe it's a question in some form. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sounds like a combo. We have no seconds left. Thank you for doing. What I will say, as we work on being trauma informed, we have that recovery part. So yes, there is importance on the exposure of that work. It sounds exquisite, but my question is, how is that space being a part of the recovery process? What are the resources that are being provided to participants? A handout, a phone number, not in the 2-font display. Yes, that people are able to recover from that exposure. Yes, Cal.
And consent,
Yes,
consent to exposure.
say more.
I do think that's what art is, right? Is engaging in traumatic experiences in life, but it's important that people know that when they're walking into a space that they have the potential for that exposure.
Yeah.
And that's part of the collaboration, and like part of trauma informed is part of that relationship. Can I trust you? Are you collaborating with me about giving me the right information?
Excellent. The African American Cultural Heritage Museum in Washington, DC, there's a display on Emmett Till. There, before you enter the space, there's something in huge font that's saying what's going on. And are you ready to experience that? And you can choose to or not. It's not just on display, but you have to enter into a room. Sounds like you all have been there. Think of those action steps. I have no time. As my colleagues are standing by, they're so excited. Think of those action steps that you can take. I hope that this session has been informative. You've had an opportunity to share and network as well. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. Honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your engagement. So much to me and the world. So thank you.
Thank you.